Professor Boyer is at Rice University in Houston, the US, and he is a professor of anthropology with a very broad and impressive research and engagement portfolio focused on energy and environmental challenges, not just in the US, but also in other places, Mexico and around the world. He mentioned that it is his first time coming to China and that he will stay for a while, which I think is very exciting because this is another way for us to connect different places around the world and to get a better understanding of our current challenges. Now, Professor Boyer is a very accomplished scholar, filmmaker, writer. He has a deep, he has very strong records in publications. He has received many important scholarships from the Alexander Humboldt Foundation, from the National Science Foundation, from Fulbright, and others. But he also takes a lot of effort in bridging the academic world to the normal world and to have very wide engagement. And one of the ways he is doing that is through his podcast. And so I really recommend to take a look at that. There are already more than 250 episodes, so you could easily look back and get a good sense of what's going on in the world when it comes to energy. Now, without further talking by me, let's start to listen to this keynote. We will be listening for about 40 minutes, and after that we will have plenty of time for questions. So if you have a question, please note it down so that we can have an interdisciplinary, global, international discussion after the keynote talk. Let's give a warm applause to Professor Boyer.
Thank you so much. Boy, it's such an honor to be here with you. I love all I've heard about the EFAN series. So excited that it will continue on into the future. And I think we all know, because we're invested in it, that this is an incredibly important moment in environmental matters more generally. And so I just want to take a moment to thank Professor Barnes, Professor Cui, Professor Van den Doel, and of course Dr. Jinmin Wang, without whom I think none of this would have come together in as brilliant a way as it has. So it's just a great honor to be here with you. And what I'm going to present is essentially drawn from a chapter of my next book, the title of which is Petro-Electro: Tales from the Energy Struggle. And I use that term, I want to kind of underline that word struggle, because as much as I think we want to think we're in a moment of transition, and in some countries, from some perspectives, we are, I think the broader global story, even in Asia, is struggle. We're struggling for a new energy regime to be born. And I think we also know, because so many of you study energy here in various ways, I think that the fact that an environmental humanities conference has so many people studying energy says something about how essential finding a path forward to a less ecocidal, less genocidal mode of energy, how important that is for addressing the many environmental crises and issues that we face. And that struggle is not just a negative thing. Sometimes struggle is a good thing. And I think that we find really a moment that some people in the past couple of years have begun to say, well, two pathways are forming. There's the electrostate, right? There's the rapid electrification, and it so happens that China has a very special role to play in that, both regionally and globally, which is great, and I'll talk a little bit about that today. But really my main focus is going to be on the other side of it. What is holding us in our place? What's preventing us from changing? And oftentimes when I teach these matters to students, a lot of students who come into classes, and I don't know if it's that way here, but it's that way in the United States, they come to a class on a climate or environment, and they come in prepared to be very anxious, prepared to be very depressed, right? And one of the things that I have to tell them, first of all, is yes, you're right to feel that way. That's an honest emotional reaction to the reality of the situation we find ourselves in. We do live in tragic times. But what we don't talk enough about is we also live in epic times. This is a moment of civilizational transformation that does not come along every generation, to say the least, right? It's an epical shift that we're in the middle of what's happening now. And that's why the struggle is so intense, right? It's also why the struggle matters. So what I'm hoping this talk about the petrostate will do is to maybe give you a different sense of what the enemy is, or what we're fighting against, what we're fighting to transform, and what is holding us in place and why it's holding us to this particular way of life. So another thing that's been all the talk today, and that's also a source of anxiety and aspiration for many, is of course artificial intelligence. So I thought, well, let's see what AI does with the concept of the petrostate. So without giving it a lot of preparation, I let it loose. And this is Mid-Journey, for those of you who are wondering what the software is, to look at what a petrostate is. And I think we talk a lot today about, or doubting, we have to, as educated people, we have to doubt the intelligence of AI, because otherwise, what's our future? But, and I do agree that there's a real question about how intelligent AI is. But the part of it that interests me is we don't challenge its artificiality a lot. I don't think it's artificial at all. I think what it really is a kind of collective unconscious in the Freudian sense. It's a kind of a deep reservoir of knowledge and images that we can tap into through this technology that allows certain truths to percolate up, right? There's resistance, just as Freud said, there's symptoms and displacements. But when you look at this, and you think, okay, this is what AI tells us the petrostate looks like, I'm actually kind of encouraged that from the deep epistemic guts of our collective unconscious, this is what the petrostate is. Because do you want to live in this world? Is this a future you want to have? It's a kind of a weird, slightly unsettling, nightmare-like dystopian reality. And I think that's telling a truth that we should listen to. So maybe this is another way of thinking about how AI can guide our thinking about the future, by thinking about it as a sort of automation of the images we've collected from the past. I'm going to show you two more images before I start. This image on the left is, and I had a research librarian and their team at Rice University's Fondren Library, shout out to them. I asked, when was the first time the word petrostate was used? And it was in this 1975 issue of Forbes magazine. And the interesting thing about it is that this term was coined without anybody saying, I'm coining a new term. They just used it in a very offhand way. The article doesn't even have an author on it. It's as like it just emerged, right? And for those of you who know Hegel and Marx, and I'm assuming some of you might have some familiarity, this is precisely how Hegel and then Marx would say knowledge evolves. Something happens in the world, in the material world, and it kind of concretizes to extent. It becomes dense enough as a part of our phenomenology that it then percolates up as a kind of concept floating like the tip of an iceberg. And that's what a petrostate is. And what's so beautiful is that the cover image is a tank with a wind-up device on top of it. I'm going to talk a lot about tanks, or a little bit about tanks today. And then on the right image is when I asked AI to tell me what metabolism of the petrostate looks like. This is what it gave me. I really liked this image genuinely. I think every once in a while AI is capable of doing something artistic and interesting, and this is one of those moments for me. So I'm going to leave it up here as a muse while I talk a little bit more. Thank you. So, with those preliminaries in mind, why talk about the petrostate today? Why not, as is more common, simply talk about the power of the oil and gas industry, or fossil fuel interests, or fossil capitalism, if you want to get fancy and technical and theoretical about it? State theories typically define the state around the existence of a supreme authority. And Stuart Hall, who for my money is one of the best theorists of the state there is, argues that the fundamental function of the state is rule. And that while rule can take many forms, it always involves, as he puts it here, the subjection of its subjects to the powers of the state, its domination over them. To guarantee rule, the sociologist Max Weber spotlights the monopolization of legitimate violence as the critical feature of state domination. And I think so far so good. But in the energo-political framework that I propose, we need to pay greater attention to a problem that most state theories consider relatively trivial. That is, how domination is accomplished. And since the late 19th century, the 1879 Zulu War is often mentioned, it has essentially been impossible to dominate anyone for any length of time without the use, directly or indirectly, of fossil fuel infrastructure and the steel-based weaponry it made possible. First, this dependence focused on the nexus of coal, steam, and steel, which provided the energo-material underpinning of state and imperial monopolies of violence after the 1850s, the Bessemer process, and so on. Then came the First World War, when tanks and warplanes and chemical weapons revolutionized combat again, and the state's ability to rule shifted decisively to dependence upon petroleum extraction. For nearly 2 centuries, fossil fuels have shaped rule, subjection, domination in fundamental ways. The hegemonic petropower of our times is agnostic to the mode of state rule. It enables liberal, illiberal, state socialist regimes without hesitation, and it seems very comfortable operating outside the spotlight. The reason why we discount petropower is that oil often seems to us as something commonplace, a mere commodity, a simple economic object traded by sovereign actors, utilized by consumers in just regular market activity. But in the spirit of the philosopher Michel Foucault's work on what he called biopouvoir, or what we might call in English biopower, I'd suggest an inverse way of thinking about what petropower is. As Hall observed, state power is a matter of capacity first and of right afterwards. So too is petroleum a matter of capacity, of enablement in its truest sense of pouvoir or power, not as a noun, but as a modal verb. That's the premise I'd like to explore in this lecture. It helps us to think about the tenacity and invisibility of petropower in the face of the climate emergency, perhaps in slightly new ways. And to return to the concept of petrostate, by state, I just don't mean a fixed political form or assemblage of institutions and apparatus, but also think of it in English, we might say, I'm in a state of bliss. And that's also how I mean petrostate. The world is enthralled by oil. We are all thralls of oil. And that's the truth that the concept of petrostate is seeking to capture and express. So let me put a little more bone, a little more flesh on the skeleton. 4 theses on the petrostate. The petrostate, contrary to what you might have heard, is not a nation-state scaled entity. There aren't some states that are petrostates and others that are not petrostates. It's not a petrostate or petrostates that we should be concerned with. That is, countries whose national economies depend on some arbitrary percentage of oil revenue. Expert discourse on petrostates to date has been dominated by the resource curse meta-narrative, sometimes RCM, use that acronym, which defines petrostates, especially in the global south, as deviations from norms of neoliberal clientage. This limited concept of the petrostate maligns and caricatures the efforts of countries that seek to use petroleum to accomplish independent programs of national development. Think of Chavismo in Venezuela, for example. What the RCM leaves blatantly unspoken, meanwhile, is the capture of northern political institutions and dynamics by petropower. So instead of petrostates, we should be thinking about the petrostate as fundamentally a global, or better yet, a planetary assemblage. Even in its earliest booms in East Texas and Baku, petroleum exhibited world-shaping features, for example, in its rapid capture of private transportation. But the 20th century world wars created a truly planetary petrostate for the first time. With that said, the petrostate also obviously manifests nationally and locally in a more familiar institutional network of roots and nodes like oil companies and gas stations and wellheads and so on. Second, The petrostate depends upon corporate power, but its network exceeds the corporate complex of parastatal and private oil exploration, extraction, and processing entities. The petrostate incorporates transnational socio-material systems like circulatory infrastructure, think tanker ships or pipelines, and extraction zones, but also petroepistemic engines like think tanks, media, and indeed universities. I work for a university whose largest corporate donor is ExxonMobil, right? We are part of the petrostate in a fundamental way. In addition, the petrostate manifests in the social organization of space around automobility. Cities built for the convenience of cars, extending down to the level of petrol pumps and the extravagant fuel-guzzling SUVs that frequent them. It appears most intimately in petrochemical derivative compounds and abundant petroplastics that exploit the porosity of environments and bodies. Micro and nanoplastics scale the rule of the petrostate down to a cellular level. The petrostate is thus at once more ubiquitous and tenacious than is normally assumed, but conversely, and here's the good news, because I promise you there is some good news in my talk, it's also more vulnerable. Whatever they tell you, the agents of the petrostate already know that the petrostate has no future. I'm telling you that from somebody who lives in Houston, Texas, the white-collar center of the oil industry. They know it's over. They know the game is over. I really want to underscore that. And this is why they embrace post-truth so avidly. Truth has become their enemy. And the backdraft of this most powerful industry in the world embracing post-truth has drawn the entire world, at least the entire United States and its allies, into a hallucinatory situation of paranoia, conspiracy theory, post-truth of all different kinds. Why? Why do they know it has no future? The climate emergency is part of the problem. The reality of the climate emergency. The staggering inefficiency of petro machines is another. An electric vehicle is 5 times more efficient than a conventional gas engine in its use of energy. The looming biopolitical threats of rampant plastic waste is still another. China, we're very proud to be today, was the last great hope for growing global oil demand for fuel. It was all based for many years upon China expanding, modernizing, and committing to more fossil fuel use. That was the whole model. But you've already reached your peak of oil demand for fuel. So good for you. The gap between the petroepistemic ideology and reality is expanding, much like the ideological overdrive of the last decades of European state socialism. The petrostate, while still immensely capable and dangerous, also feels senescent, droning on about the glories of the past as it struggles to kill the multitude of futures that would bury it. Petrostate ideology is not the only epistemic grounds for the white supremacist politics of the future called patriotic nostalgia these days, but it fuels all the others, quite literally. And as the most powerful political assemblage on the planet increasingly abandons empirical reality, it creates a permission structure for post-truth projects and occult thinking of all kinds. It wasn't always this way. When I was growing up in the 1970s and 1980s in the United States, the petrostate confidently, very openly occupied both science and culture. The petrostate today is in a different situation, much more like a damaged Terminator, with its decorative flesh hanging off and its steel skeleton and surveillance cameras exposed. At least it's more obvious now what kind of killer it is we're dealing with. Fourth, and finally, the death of the petrostate is not guaranteed to come with the end of petroleum use. It is sustained by a complex infrastructural metabolism. But since it also depends on human beings, there are constant opportunities for trouble. To locate those opportunities, we need to pay attention to petrostate anabolics, the upscaling resource-consuming forces that synthesize petrocultural forms, and petrostate catabolics, the disruptive forces that release stored energy so that the petrostate can adapt to new situations. Metabolism, like capitalism, maintains order by generating disorder. Yet even so, there may be xenobiotics, metabolically useless and potentially damaging forms of life that could stress the infrastructural metabolism of the petrostate long enough to bring about its necessary downfall. So let's talk about that. I don't know when you might learn biology in China, so I'm just going to say from my perspective, we learned it in middle school, 7th or 8th grade usually. So in those classes, you might remember that any creature needs a healthy balance of animalism and catabolism to sustain itself. Examples of animalism in biology include building protein from amino acids, synthesizing carbohydrates from sugar, and muscle growth and repair. Catabolism, meanwhile, involves processes like converting glycogen to glucose, breaking down triglycerides into fatty acids, and digestion. Ideally, anabolism and catabolism are reciprocal processes in a kind of a balance with each other. Catabolism, for example, releases stored energy that anabolism can utilize for new growth projects. The infrastructural metabolism of the petrostate, as I see it, has similar dynamics. Petrostate anabolics include, among other activities, the capture of land and subsoil resources, the construction of petropolitical infrastructure, and the enrollment and enskillment of legions of workers and consumers of oil. Not all anabolic activities are equivalent, however, and if we wish to understand the current growth dynamics of the petrostate, we need to pay special attention to domains like military activity and petrochemicals. Globally, military activity uses about 3 times as much petroleum as civil aviation. The United States military accounts for about 3/4 of that activity and uses over 100 million barrels of oil a year, a carbon footprint larger than countries like Portugal and Denmark. But the anabolic value of military activity to the petrostate exceeds routine fuel consumption. It is also about asserting subjection and domination over what Reza Negarestani terms anonymous materials of all kinds. The U.S. military's forever war in the Middle East, the latest chapter of which is the current conflict with Iran, and it doesn't matter if Trump says it's over now because that conflict will endure and evolve as it always has. This isn't one obvious case in point of what I'm talking about. The constant presence of imperial war machines in the region with the largest petroleum reserves justifies the scale of the U.S. military-industrial complex as much as anything. A less obvious case of anabolic petropolitics is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Although Putin's aggression is most often described as a nostalgia for Soviet empire, the conflict has always fundamentally been about energy. Even before the Maidan Revolution and Viktor Yanukovych's ouster, a struggle over gas imports was brewing. Although Yanukovych's government is normally remembered as being pro-Russian, it presided over an almost 40% decrease in Russian gas imports. Worse still, the 2010 discovery of the giant Yuzivska gas field, the 3rd largest gas field in Europe, threatened eventual Ukrainian independence from Russian petropower. With the near depletion of Ukraine's conventional gas field, the development of Yuzivska was a game changer that held the potential to rebalance European energy politics for decades to come. Although Russian firms bid for the exploration and production partnership, Yanukovych's government announced in 2012 that Royal Dutch Shell and Chevron were the chosen partners. This move to bring Western oil majors into Ukraine unsettled Putin and his Gazprom allies. Shortly thereafter, they took advantage of the revolutionary moment in Ukraine in 2014 to move the battlefield closer to the gas field. Within a year, both Chevron and Shell had pulled out of their partnerships because of the war. The significance of Yuzivska intensified after the 2022 invasion, with the brutal conflict over the town of Bakhmut being an excellent case in point. More than one news report treated Bakhmut like it was a random town. Reuters said it's a town of little strategic significance. Again, oil sort of flying under the radar. It's a really curious description because the Bakhmut Depression is precisely the southeastern edge of the Yuzivska gas field. Control over Yuzivska would considerably strengthen Putin's strategy of weaponizing Russia's gas exports while simultaneously thwarting competitive Ukrainian supply to Western Europe. Even rendering Yuzivska a militarized no man's land of ruins would set Ukraine's movement towards energy independence and sovereignty back for decades, and that's precisely what's happened so far. So I consider the military conflict a good example of maintenance anabolics, humming war machines that help the Petrostate to maintain its surface and subsurface territories, reminding the world that the monopoly of violence is only guaranteed through the medium of fossil fuels. Where the Petrostate is bulking up, however, is in plastics. Throughout the oil industry, dreams are rippling of a plastic future that will offset the coming decline of oil burned as fuel. As of the beginning of this year, there were 132 petroleum refineries operating in the United States. Only 7 of them were built since the year 2000. The CEO of Chevron, Mike Wirth, said a few years ago that he doubted another new fuel refinery would ever be built in the United States. But Chevron and most of the other oil majors are investing hundreds of millions of dollars in building new plastic plants, like this new Shell chemical complex the size of 300 football fields in Pennsylvania. It represents the largest industrial project in that state since the Second World War, with the capacity to produce 1.6 million tons of plastic pellets a year. Despite growing concerns about the health and ecological damage already being caused by overwhelming plastic pollution, energy research firm Wood Mackenzie expects that demand for naphtha and liquefied petroleum gas, two key petrochemical feedstocks, will grow by 50% by 2050. Turning now to catabolics, I have argued elsewhere that the historical spine of the petrostate was automobility. Automobility is what catalyzed the petrostate as we know it. The first 4 decades of petroleum extraction focused on providing light and heat, for example, producing kerosene as an alternative to whale oil. But it was transportation mechanics and logistics, from asphalt and road making to gasoline and engines, that allowed petroleum to make a state in its own image in the early decades of the 20th century. Once the core of petrostate anabolics, transportation has now become a site of catabolic activity, particularly as China and Europe race to replace internal combustion engines with electric alternatives. EV battery costs dropped at the end of 2024 to price parity with internal combustion engines for the first time, and they'll become 17% cheaper every time EV production doubles globally from here on out. The gas car will soon be a thing of the past, and we can all hope that, if not ourselves, that our children will play in the ruins of petrol stations. But the story isn't over, because, as noted, the petrostate has contingency plans rooted in plastics and petrochemicals. But it's also forced to expend more energy today than in the past, focused on generating disinformation, to deny climate science, to slow down electrification. Oh, EVs don't work as well, the heat pumps aren't so great, just to cloud public understanding of the technical superiority of electrical machines. Oil and gas companies spent $445 million on the 2024 US elections to guarantee a petrostate-friendly political agenda. And in some sense, maybe it was a good investment for them. But these are weird times, as we've been saying, and for that price, they probably didn't anticipate the White House momentarily becoming a Tesla showroom. Another important area of petrostate catabolics involves rearguard defensive maneuvers to guarantee that fossil fuels retain a significant share of electricity generation across the world. In my own little corner of the petrostate in Texas, that is clearly visible as the state government has become increasingly desperate and delusional in its efforts to limit renewable energy and battery development projects, despite the fact that these projects are the most affordable to consumers, the easiest and fastest to construct, and the fact that Texas is already leading the United States in wind power, residential solar power, and grid-scale battery installations. Natural gas, meanwhile, catastrophically underperformed during the winter storm Uri in 2021, taking the islanded Texas grid within a few minutes of total collapse. Nonetheless, the Texas legislature seriously considered a bill in its last session that would have mandated 1 new megawatt of natural gas for each new megawatt of wind, solar, and batteries, a policy that Texas's most trusted grid expert Doug Lewin described as the, quote, most heavy-handed anti-market kind of legislation he'd ever seen in the history of Texan energy. Until recently, Texas was considered a free market paradise of energy development, but we see now the Petrostate working overtime to undermine cherished liberal principles of private property in a bid to keep fossil fuels from being swept out of the Texas grid by the better prices, technologies, and logistics of renewable energy. In the old days, Petrostate metabolism attuned itself to the rhythm of booms and busts that had been the heartbeat of oil since its inception. Infrastructure was built, deployed, and then idled in rapid succession. Oil fields came and went, even as the easy oil of the first 70 years of the 20th century, as Stephanie Lemenager describes it, became the tough oil of the past 5 decades. Tough oil means more capital, risk, and environmental damage for successful extraction. And I know what you're thinking. The Petrostate metabolism has weathered so many crises, so many challenges in the past, it seems invulnerable. Nothing, not peak oil phantoms, not the threat of nuclear energy, not pandemics, not financial crashes, nothing has fundamentally disrupted the homeostatic balance of its anabolic and catabolic processes, at least not yet. But still, I'd argue that the Petrostate has actually slipped into a state of metabolic imbalance over the past 15 years. If you look at individual countries, particularly the United States, you might see the opposite, as we have become, proudly to some, the largest Petrostate in the conventional sense of the term in the history of the planet, since the shale oil revolution of the early 2010s. But elsewhere in the world, again led by China and Europe, metabolic stress is clearer. The good news about the Petrostate's metabolic imbalance is that it is burning a lot of its complex relationships and the stored energy within them along the way. Anabolism is about growth, yes, but also about regeneration. The Petrostate is stressed and working overtime to guarantee its dominion will extend for another generation. The Petrostate, in other words, is literally starting to eat itself alive. It is beginning to die, but the problem is it's not dying nearly fast enough from the point of view of the climate emergency. So, what can be done? Staying within the paradigm of metabolism, let's talk about xenobiotics. The core idea of xenobiosis is that certain kinds of so-called foreign materials and agents can slow down or disrupt a creature's metabolic activity. I find the characterization of foreignness a little suspect, a reminder of the way that ecological and metabolic theories co-evolved with liberal and imperial ideas about bounded bodies and racial hierarchies. As Zoe Todd reminds us, even the sinister plague of petroplastics can be seen through another lens as the weaponization of ancient algal kin. So while I do like the idea of meddling with petrostate metabolism, I think xenobiosis needs some creative reformulation politically, and that's what I want to do now. In this spirit, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, here is a small bestiary of xenobiotes that illustrates some of the disruptive and decompositional tactics that could be applied toward the petrostate. The first category of xenobiotes I want to talk about is the kaiju. If we learn nothing else from Godzilla, it's that sometimes to disable one megascale monster, you have to find another mega willing to take it on. The ideal kaiju to take on the petrostate would be a functional, reasonable, humane global government. But because what the petrostate fears above all is any kind of global regulatory apparatus, its legions of agents relentlessly demonize, mock, and undermine the prospect of global political movements and institutions. For the moment, we have to rely on lesser kaiju like finance capital, the second most wealthy and powerful industry in the world, very likely, plus a Frankenstein's monster worth of nation-state and municipal political initiatives. None of these have proved durable adversaries to the petrostate as of yet, but sometimes working in combination, they can effectively put stress on the petrostate metabolism for periods of time. The problem with kaiju is that while their political potential is immense, like all monsters, they are ponderous and impossible to control. If you're trusting finance, for example, or banks to bring down the petrostate, you should probably rescale your expectations for salvation. No one tells Godzilla what to do. A second category of xenobiotes occupies a more human scale and is prone to trickery, misdirection, and mischief. I'm speaking, of course, of changelings. This room is filled with very respectable, professional intellectuals. I'm happy to be among you. Collectively speaking, we have excellent taste in food, wine, shoes, even. But perhaps some of us might dress in black at night and slip out, join a group like the tire extinguishers who deflate SUV tires by putting little peas into them to irritate the owners and vendors of the neighborhood tank fleet. Maybe your idea of a good time is not hopping on a flight to nowhere, but rather re-enchanting the landscape already at hand in the manner of the situationist Deleuze. Perhaps you make your own clothes. Perhaps you studiously avoid the use of plastic. It's tough, but it can be done. Maybe you secretly engage in what Stacy Alaimo calls ecodelic activities instead of normative petro-thrills. For the rule of the petrostate to proceed with minimal metabolic stress, the petrostate would greatly prefer it if all of us were to stay in our subject positions and behave in predictable ways. So let's not do that. Let's become a shape-shifting, irritating presence within petroculture. As humans, let's foot drag, evade, slander, and sabotage. But changelings are also more than human. An EV is a kind of shapeshifter, so is a heat pump. We need lots and lots of these pod beings to snatch bodies away from the petrostate and replace them with uncanny replicants. A third category of xenobiotes are subjects equipped to resist and occupy the petrostate at smaller scales. As noted before, even if we stopped extracting and burning fossil fuels today, micro and nano petrokin would continue battling us at a cellular level for many years to come. So we need to foment micro and nano xenobiosis too. In our chaotic and flimsy manifesto called Hyposubjects, ecological philosopher Timothy Morton and I speculate about the kinds of political potentialities that this era of hyperobjects and hypersubjects have unleashed. Among the characters in that book are the micronauts, a class of subscendent kaiju, figures who pursue heroic adventures across the microverse. Indeed, their revolutionary metabolic activities are happening right now, among other places, in your own body. Apologies, but your body is the world is your body, you don't own it, it owns you. And that body is less like a sealed jar and more like a porous, multitudinous ecology of bacteria, fungi, and viruses far exceeding your own so-called human cells. You couldn't digest food nor claim a functional immune system without micronauts. How could they help to end the petrostate? Some bacteria eat oil, others dissolve plastic, so they may prove to be among our most effective allies in the long run of decomposing the petrostate. Yet, as with macro kaiju, micronaut adventures are not ours to imagine and steer. Their pouvoir deserves our respect, though. Their power deserves our respect. After all, there have only been 2 species in the history of Earth that have decisively transformed the life world of every other species with whom they cohabited. Homo sapiens, you know about us, but also cyanobacteria, who oxygenated the Earth's atmosphere over 2 billion years ago. Thank you, Nicole. I heard that. I love it. In closing, it's wrapping up now. As I bring this experiment in thinking about the metabolism of the petrostate to a close, I want to acknowledge my Marxist comrades in the room, still grumbling to themselves about my casual dismissal of fossil capitalism at the beginning of my talk. I see you, I feel you, I am a Marxist. It's okay. But why do I consider fossil capitalism a manifestation of the petrostate and not vice versa? Fossil capitalism, I think, would not exist at its current scale, or with its signature political impunity, or with its accelerating death drive, without a foundational infrastructural relationship to rule, subjection, and domination. Rather than placing fossil fuel CEOs in the prisons that await them, climate scientists in places like the United States are now persecuted for the most timid reminders that the petrostatus quo is unsustainable. To call this situation fossil capitalism, I think, is to misjudge and to underestimate its political scale and capacity. If we were just struggling to overcome fossil capitalism, we could have overcome it a while ago. Consider that over half of cumulative global greenhouse gas emissions have taken place in the last 30 years, a time in which the world allegedly knew better than to continue burning fossil fuels. The opportunities for capital to innovate, electrify everything, and establish new energy rents have been there for a long time. at least since the peak nuclear era of the 1960s and 1970s. Isn't the thing we know about capitalism that everything solid is eventually supposed to melt into air, right? Somebody forgot to tell that to the Petrostate. Yet I can see that the Petrostate is a slightly blurry, slightly magical category, but if we Marxists are being honest with ourselves, so is capital. Capital for Marx was a dimension of the objectification of human labor power, specifically a result of how the division and specialization of labor severed labor's development of human capacities, both as individual and as a species. Instead of an ideal dialectical process of self-realization, capital alienated labor power in a way that could circulate beyond the self, be appropriated and commanded by others, and thus evolved into new social and material forms. As Marx wrote in the first chapter of Das Kapital, as values, all commodities are only definite masses of congealed labor time. But here's a twist to that story that we all know. Congelation is derived from the Latin verb congelare, to freeze together. And it's actually a slightly misleading translation of the actual noun Marx uses in German, gallert, which refers to a gelatinization process in which different animal substances like meat, bone, connective tissue are boiled and then cooled to produce a glue. Rather than a freezing together of independent parts, gallert indicates the ontological transformation through thermal energy, a recipe of different fleshy forms rendered into a single sticky material. Burkett and Foster argue that this gallert model of capital is more than just a metaphor. Their view is that there is a powerful energometabolic substrate to Marxist theories of labor power, alienation, and value extraction. On the topic of surplus value, they write, quote, "This surplus is not really created out of nothing. Rather, it represents capitalism's appropriation of portions of the potential work embodied in labor power recouped from metabolic regeneration, largely during non-work time." What that means is that capital is quite literally an appropriation of anabolic fleshy power, a sapping and storage of the regenerative potential of being. And I love this reading of Marx. And I don't even care if Burkett and Foster and Kohei Saito more recently imbue Marx with a greater ecological sensibility than he may deserve. He's really an accelerationist, I hate to say it. My point is just this, that this rather mystical vision of capital as stored life energy is actually quite consistent with the vision of the Petrostate metabolism I've just sketched out here. Petroleum is literally stored life energy, a buried son of algal corpse juice. The combustion of that corpse juice enables a remarkable variety of machinic processes, which in turn enable a variety of forms of productivity, violence, mobility, and plasticity. When you take all of those processes and forms in their totality, there you have the Petrostate, which, much like capital, seems to have a life of its own. But not for long, that much I can promise you. The Petrostate, I repeat, is dying. The question now is how it passes out of this world, whether in quiet hospice or in swarming genocidal, ecocidal violence. That is the political question of our times. Thank you.
So thank you very much for that. I want to open the floor to the audience, and we are open to questions from any disciplines about any part of the world. Are there any questions? Let's start from here. I'll pass the microphone to you. Maybe you can briefly mention who you are.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm Rachel Rowe. I'm a second-year PhD student from Free University of Berlin. I also research some energy transitions with a focus on China. I think your topic is very interesting, and it reminds me to think about what's the future of our world. So, to what extent the renewable energy will challenge the existing Petrostate? What will change? What may not change? Because someone criticized that renewable energy is just green capitalism, and it is just change another form of ruling. And we still rely on the fossil fuel to produce some like plastics and something else. And also renewable energy may bring other issues like the waste, solar panels, etc. So how do you think about it?
That is a great question. Thank you. It's actually a bundle of really, really important questions, and it's a bundle of questions that I think about a lot. I'm not saying I have all the answers to them, but I'll just pick out a couple threads that I think are very important. How much will renewable energy actually mean a transition? And I really learned to think about this from my fieldwork, and the fieldwork came in southern Mexico. I was working with my partner, Dr. Simony Howe, you'll get to hear from later on today. And we were doing research on Mexico's wind rush. They had a rapid development of wind farms in a very short period of time and became the densest concentration of wind farms anywhere on the planet for a while. And we worked there for 16 months in the villages that were next to the wind parks. And we talked to people who love the wind parks and a lot of people who didn't like the wind parks, and the government and the corporations and the bankers. We talked to all the stakeholders in that process. And everyone was wondering, why are these indigenous communities resisting these wind parks? Don't they care about the future of the planet? Right? It made a lot of sense in a boardroom in Mexico City or New York or in Australia where the project was being financed. And what we came to understand is that people thought about these wind parks and the way they were being developed very much like they thought about mining and other extractive industries, that a foreign company was coming, was taking control of land, was industrializing agrarian land that could have been used to grow food. So food prices were going up. The only people who were benefiting were the large landowners who were already wealthy, and they weren't reinvesting that money in their communities. They were using it to buy vacation homes in Mexico City or in Spain. And so one community activist, indigenous leader said to us, people talk about energy transition. Where's the transition? I don't see a transition here. This is the same game they've been playing with us for 500 years. And I think we went to Mexico as committed renewable energy advocates, and we left Mexico as committed renewable energy advocates. But what we learned in that field work is that it matters how it's done. It matters a lot. You can create a wind park in such a way that it is a deeply extractivist entity that just repeats the problems of petroculture over again using a different technology. But that's also not the only way you can create a wind park. And we studied alternatives there, and you begin to see them elsewhere in the world, cooperative wind park designs, community wind park designs. We've seen what's happened with solar, how it's developed and metamorphosized over time. There's a lot of different ways. So I think we have to de-fetishize the technology. The technology is not the issue here. The technology is not the salvation. It's the kind and the quality of the social relationships that are involved in the energy transition, if it's going to be a transition, that matter. So I hope that answered at least part of your question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Boyer, for this very compelling keynote talk. My question, I'm very much inspired by the idea of digital infrastructural metabolism. So I want to ask more about the digital infrastructure, especially the role of media that's we're all implicated in it, and how that facilitates our engagement with the Petrostate and our own in your work, the metamorphosis, the self-transformation. So that's my question.
It's a great question. Again, a very important question. And I can take it in a couple of different directions. I'll just try two. One is that I think if you wonder why the United States has degenerated into such a kind of chaotic and seemingly irrational, hallucinatory political situation, I do think that media are a really big part of that story. And I think that what's happened, especially since the 1980s, with the corporate consolidation of media, with media being placed increasingly in the hands of oligarchs and billionaires, and that's accelerating under the current administration too, you find that it's harder and harder to find the kinds of questioning of power that are helpful if you actually want to have a debate about, or even just to figure out what the truth of the matter is. Large sort of mouthpieces, sort of amplifiers are given to people who are clearly placed there to promote the propaganda of oil companies, for example. Historians Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway in their book Merchants of Doubt have laid this all out. They used to work for the cigarette companies and they moved to work for the oil companies, and they're in the business of denying, and if denial doesn't work, creating uncertainty, so people just wonder, well, it seems like there are two sides to this issue of anthropogenic climate emissions, and that stalls. And what the Petrostate is doing is playing for time right now. It's trying to extract as much as it can as long as it lives. And it is going to die, but it's going to make it as slow and painful and horrible as possible, right? And media abet that process, they assist that process, and I think that I really wish that in the United States, at least, that we had a stronger tradition of public broadcasting, an independent, well-financed public broadcasting that could do what function it serves in other countries, right? Where it just, yes, there are private media who have private media perspectives, fine, but there is at some level media that exists not for profit, not to make money, but simply to sort of do the best they can to educate people and tell people the truth as well as we can understand it. If we had those institutions in the United States, I think our political culture would be much more reasonable. That's my sense. The second part of that, and I'll just make this shorter because the first part went a little long. The second part of that is to say that I think we're entering into a whole new media ecology with the data centers and artificial intelligence, and I don't think that it's intrinsically negative. I do think there are possibilities here that could be beneficial. I think there are applications that could be beneficial, but I'm really skeptical of a lot of infrastructural investment in media to fund things like cryptocurrencies, to these sorts of things that are just grifts, we would call in the United States. It's just ways to make money, to con people out of money. And unfortunately, that's kind of what we have at the highest levels of government, is con men running a country. And you're getting the type, criminals do crimes, that's what they do. And so in some ways it's not surprising, but it's really disappointing. And I'm sure the rest of the world looks with their jaws sagging like, how did it get this bad? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but I think unfortunately this new potentially revolutionary technology has created a lot of opportunities for people to scam and con people out of things. And I know that Asia is not free of that too. It feels like it's become more institutionalized now in the United States, which is really unfortunate. So that's an aspect of media that concerns me a lot too. Like, how can we find our way to the better applications, the better uses? How can we not mortgage our water resources, our air quality, our energy quality? Data centers are really bad for your electricity. People don't talk enough about this. They because of how they work and how the computational processes work, they really make the quality of our electricity a lot worse, and it could damage equipment really easily. So in the United States, like 50% or more, it's like 80% of people who have sort of bad intermittent electricity quality live within 50 miles of a data center, and that's not accidental. So they're doing all sorts of harm. They could be doing some good, but it's being not designed in a sort of responsible way, unfortunately. So I hope it gets better, but I'm not sure it will, at least where we are for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Boyer. That was, I would say the talk was virtuous in the scales and metaphors and the ways in which you mobilize and ideas. It was something that I really resonated with you. But my question is around two others that you talk. Changes. Your second thesis on the Petrostate and the death of Petrostate. Now, in the second thesis, you know that the Petrostate depends on our that exceeds oil and gas, or exceeds the oil and gas industry. If the Petrostate is a changeling, in actually one version of this question is wrong. Why name the Petrostate as sort of bounded in that way, if what you're suggesting in your thesis is that it may have preceded or the last with Petrostate and then move on to something else? In which case, if it's a shifter, can it die?
Great question. Virtuosic in its own way. I would say, the changeling here is not the Petrostate itself, although it is ruses, it has masks. The changeling, in my mind, is kind of a xenobiote that helps to destabilize. And I'm sorry if that wasn't clear in the talk. As you said, covers a lot of ground, sometimes irresponsibly jumping from topic to topic, but it hopefully keeps it a little more entertaining. I think that that point about the Petrostate, the second thesis, is really about trying to get beyond this idea that what we're fighting are the oil and gas companies. Because I do think those companies, it almost across the board, almost universally, have behaved terribly. In the time we lived in Houston, we have seen these companies time and time again say, listen, we know you're anxious about this climate change problem. Don't worry, we're taking care of it. We're going to develop fourth generation algal biofuels, and that'll be the new thing, right? Nope, it's not that, sorry. Carbon sequestration, that's what we're going to develop, and that's going to help, sort of decarbonize the atmosphere, reduce emissions. Oh, wait, it's not that actually, it's hydrogen. We're going to do hydrogen, right? No problems with hydrogen for anybody who doesn't know about the Hindenburg disaster, right? And putting a lot of hydrogen in places, a very volatile gas can do. But to be serious, time and again, as part of their strategy of just drawing this out and as much as possible, pretending to be the reasonable experts in the room, they do that every day. They just conned our university at Rice into signing on to a new energy center that is, I think, I didn't read all the details, but it's very disappointing to see like yet another university fall for yet another fossil fuel industry gambit. Because we all know, I think, if they were serious about change, if they were serious about the quality of life of the planet and humans and non-human beings, they would have been working to kill themselves, unfortunately. That terminology may be harsh, but to put themselves out of business at least for decades. They've known longer than anyone else has known what's happening, basically, and they have studiously avoided acting on that knowledge, right? Again, a post-truth position. So, I think that it is that, but it's also the fact that in various ways we have been co-opted. We continue to go along with it, to give them more time instead of demanding immediate change. I think we have to accept that responsibility too. We're not innocent in this, anybody who's ever used fossil fuels, as all of us have. And I like to point out when I come into a room like this, I'm guessing all of the plastic in this room has been made from petroleum, and there's a lot of it in the chairs. The carpet's made of petroleum, probably some of the insulation in the ceiling. I look around the room and I see petroleum everywhere in this room, just not in the form of liquid fuel. And so this is the challenge, and why it's not really about just ending an oil company's power, but it really is a more fundamental and ergo material proposition of getting to a point in the development of a civilization that does not require these fuel forms to operate. Because as long as it does, we're likely to be continuing in one way or another to be, whether it's through burning fuels and putting emissions in the air, or by putting more and more plastics into our environment with, I don't know how much you've read the science, maybe other people here will speak to it, I hope so. The science I've read is very concerning about what all these plastics are doing as they break down and get into our various parts of our body. So we have sort of two mega problems to deal with within the Petrostate: plasticity and then fuel. Anyway, so a bit of a rambling answer, sorry, great question, thank you very much.
That was a fantastic comment. I really love that you returned to German, so we thank Marx's idea of capitalist metabolic digestion of the world and the laborers. Because you're giving this keynote in China, I want to inform you that Lu Xun, the father of modern Chinese literature, and one of the greatest intellectuals of all time in the early 20th century, understood in a short story called Children, with people, that's what was happening.
Oh, awesome.
That this new world that was coming into shape before his eyes was encouraging people to be cannibalistic. So just look up Lu Xun. But also, I want to return to your question. I'm sorry, your name? Jane. I understood his question to say that the gift of your concept in Petrostate is that it is everywhere. Like you say, plastics are everywhere in our world. They're inside of our own bodies. The mindset that all of us have, So won't the kleptocracy persist? We've got kleptocratic con men running every single political game on this planet. They're mostly, that's what I'm saying, con men, and there's the women, but they do the men thing.
I accept that characterization.
Yeah. They're going to persist, right? I mean, maybe I'm misunderstanding you, but because they are they're not going to be satisfied with not being multi-billionaires, ever. I don't see that possibility. So can you think with us a little bit about the collapse is not just the petrostate, but it's the global food system. It's water access. It's the air itself. It's everything is crumbling. So where is the hope in recreating a worldview that gives us a commons, that gives us a possibility of not being so addicted to plastics that they're in our own brains? I want the hope.
Yeah.
I want the way out. And I'm not yet convinced that the petrostate is going to just die. I think it's going to be the second possibility state at the end, that it's going to go out in genocidal violence that is globally, potentially just destroys everything. Sorry to be such a downer.
No, I mean, I think that's when we think about the political stakes of our moment, like the time that we've been given here. I think that is the question, right? And what can we do ethically, collectively, and less importantly individually, because I think the collective work is what matters, to steer away from that less or more dystopian situation, because I think that is the default. That's the default trajectory we're on, is towards more genocidal, ecocidal violence before this is over. It's a hard question to answer. Annemieke indexed this a little bit when she was doing the intro. Like, one of the reasons why I can only exist somewhat uncomfortably in like a pure academic setting is because that problem is what keeps me up at night, you know? And you can give and write a million things about the petrostate, and it's not necessarily going to move the needle on that bigger problem, right? You have to think about ways, and I'm a big advocate of whether it's podcasting or art or writing or like or just what I do in Houston to help combat the impacts of climate change is I dig rain gardens with community leaders that are trying to get, a little bit more control over the flooding in their neighborhood. And this is the thing they can do with shovels, because the technology is simple and it just requires a certain amount of power, and it gives them a little more control, a little more leverage over how catastrophic rainfall impacts where they live. I think those kinds of small projects, what Donna Haraway calls refuge making, is so important as just a way to engage the world. And I think, I guess what gives me hope in that situation is I think of the billionaire and now trillionaire class, because I call them the illionaires and the sort of millionaire, billionaire, and now trillionaire class. And I've got a project with an Egyptian artist, Ganzir, in which we're I should spoil it, but it's coming out in a magazine that's devoted to kind of lampooning Elon Musk and the kind of billionaire class. And I think when you think about this truly kind of wretched, narcissistic way of life that they preach and advocate, I don't think it's what most people aspire to. I don't think it makes, obviously they're not happy. If they were so happy, then why are they trying so hard to get to Mars, right? Where they will be even more miserable than they would be on the United States, in the United States, right? Silicon Valley, this Earth, whatever. And so I have to think that over time, because we have had, in the past, in the late 19th century, a time when predatory billionaires, the equivalent of billionaires, were sort of allowed to wreak havoc. And whether it was through political institutions or morality or other kinds of mechanisms, brought into a new phase. I don't think this is endless, because this is fundamentally unsustainable. It can only lead to collapse. So maybe what we have to do is play for time and build our refuges and ride out the collapse. And there's an argument for that. Maroon thinking, as some critical Black studies intellectuals talk about, marronage as an ethical relationship to the present. But I also think that, there's so many more of us than there are of them. right? And this is why they're so anxious. They know that when we figure that out, their game is over, right? The world that they propose only benefits a very small number of people, really like less than 1,000 people, like empirically. And there are millions of us, billions of us, who are not benefiting from this arrangement in any substantial way. So the question is, how do we, whether it's through socialism or social democracy or some kind of neo-eco-liberalism, like find our way forward to the kinds of political movements and institutions that can challenge that, put reins on this class as they have been chained in the past, and try to create new political possibilities for, I think, humbler, more just ways of being in the world. I would say unapologetically more feminist ways of being in the world. I think that is, again, this is when I talk about the epic moment we live in, that's just kind of what you're talking about is what I'm thinking, right? This is an epic time. And we're being asked to do something unprecedented, which is to try to repair a deeply flawed and broken civilization wrought by kind of European imperial and colonial expansion over the past 500 years. We're trying to either repair that or find a way to get to the next thing without the world laying in ruins and the misery that would involve, right? And so that is not something most generations, any generations, have been asked to do, which is why I think this could be seen as a moment of tremendous opportunity, but know, that there are people out there who want that ruin because they want the world to exist as a kind of image of their shattered souls, basically. These are deeply flawed. I mean, we're all flawed, right? I'm not saying some of us are beautiful, wonderful, perfect people, but these are people who are deeply sort of negative in their relationship to the world. They try to negate anything that's not them. They try to enslave anything that's not them. And I just don't think that's the global civilization that most of us want. So that maybe gives me a little bit of hope. Thanks so much for a great question, though. It's beautiful.
Thank you, Professor Boyer, so much for a really fascinating talk. I'm Adam Vignan of the Energy University of Hong Kong. I was really struck by what you said, that China was the last big frontier for growing the Petrostate. And maybe another way to put that, other scholars have said China saved global capitalism by opening up into the 1980s and 90s and allowing global capital to circulate. So there's kind of an interesting way to think about that as centers petroleum. And then you also kind of alluded to how, well, if there is a last grasp for the fossil fuel industry, it would be plastic packaging. And like many African countries are being targeted to try and get disposable packaging embedded in lifestyles and the area of growth. Some Asian countries are being targeted in the same way. So I was just wondering, do you believe that there is actually like a possibility for this expansion? Does that actually, possibly extend the life of the Petrostate or the petro global industrial complex? And I'm also just kind of wondering, like, how does that fact that that might be the last grasp, how does that set or reset the political field going forward? And I think, you said many things that are relevant to that question. You also had kind of a defense of some small kind of micro sabotage, like political acts, like putting a key in people that SUV car tires so they deflate. You even mentioned avoiding plastic, those kinds of heroic efforts to avoid plastic. And I'm just wondering, like, how you balance that, because some scholars would argue that that heroic effort that certain individuals take to avoid plastic in their everyday lives is counterproductive. It's actually it's so focused on individual behaviors that it functions to secure and reproduce the petros status quo. I love that phrase. So I'm just wondering, like, back to that, how do you think about these as a transgressive relationships with plastic and whether or not they're able to have complex which have upstream in that mind of afflicting the supply chain, so to speak?
Yeah, this is great. By the way, like all these questions have been amazing. Thank you. Like each one of them has been fascinating and multi-layered, and this one's no exception. Thank you, Adam. I think yes, I do think that they will expand plastic, and they are expanding plastic, and I know it's their plan because I've heard them say it, in their meetings. And again, Houston is a place where you get to kind of eavesdrop on what the oil and gas industry is thinking. You get to sort of see the Petrostate. It's like the play space for the Petrostate where they test things out and they kind of figure out what their strategies are. And for 100%, they're betting on plastic. So that push into Africa, more single-use plastics, maybe resisting certain things. Oh, well, maybe we won't, make as much styrofoam now, but there's some other plastic that they're pushing on the other side of it. You can be sure of that because it essentially is the future. And there have been other, again, possible futures, hydrogen. People say geothermal energy now is possible too, but really plastics is where all their bets are being laid. So I think that is, again, as big a challenge as this energy transition, or as I like to think of it, energy struggle is, I think the struggle over the material world and to what extent petrochemically derived compounds are going to be essential features of that is just as important. And I don't think, maybe it's because I don't work in that area as centrally, maybe I don't hear as much about it, but I don't feel like it gets the same level of attention, at least in my spheres, that I hear about the energy problem. But plastics is as big a problem. In fact, the two are intimately linked. They should be working together, not just fighting about, getting more EVs on the road, but also getting more plastic. And at the core of this is an area of scholarship that I've become very interested in thinking with. I'm not saying I advocate it 100%, and I can go into that later if you want, is degrowth. It's a conversation that came out of the 1970s, limits of growth crisis, and some very interesting kind of maverick Marxian figures like Andrei Gortz or Ivan Illich, and more recently ecological economists like Kate Rayworth have done amazing work in this area. And the idea, of course, is that green growth only takes us so far. It takes too long, and it doesn't address all of the problems that we're trying to face. Where degrowth really focuses its critical attention, and I think it's smart, is on obsolescence. Like that's the real big problem, is obsolescence, as well as the fact that there's no kind of use of these materials with a sense of conscience built in. So obsolescence is a really interesting way to kind of look at the problem that we're facing in a different way. Like actually, if you look at like the sort of carbon footprint problem, and I were to say, you want to get a new car, right? Already it's not a great decision, right? You should be using public transportation or riding a bike or walking if you can, but you can't always. And we even see that in Kunshan, as we're going around. It'd be hard probably to do all of your mobility here without some kind of a car. So, what's your choice? Well, you could buy a new conventional fossil fuel vehicle. You could, in many countries, that's still cheaper. You could buy an electric vehicle. Sounds like a good thing, new electric vehicle. But actually, the truth of it is that the best decision you can make is to get a used vehicle, a vehicle that's already been used, doesn't matter what its energy form is, and try to get all the life you can out of that. Right, so a different way of thinking about what the problem is, about again, and maybe here we were talking over lunch about the circular economy, nothing goes to waste. Like think a lot about the life cycle of whatever you're using, try to extend it as long as possible. That principle might be even more powerful than electrification when we think about sort of moving in the right direction environmentally. And I think that we could think about the same problem with plastics. Like with AI, it might be that plastics have a really important role to play, like in medicine, for example. Maybe even single-use plastics in medicine make our lives safer, make ourselves able to fend off certain kinds of diseases. I accept that, right? But that's a very different proposition than everyone has to have a plastic fork or a disposable chopstick or something like that, what they're using. And so an issue over the ethics of plastic use would be a really fascinating conversation to have. Where could we ethically use plastic? Where could plastic be durable instead of obsolescent? Where could plastic be persistent? And we think about plastic persistence as a problem, and it is. But what if you only needed one water bottle and it was safe for you to use, and that could be your water bottle, and that's the water bottle you had, and you didn't need 10 of them, and you didn't have to replace it every year? Might that be better than a ceramic or a wood or some other kind of material. I mean, these are, so to your point, I think the plastics problem is here. It's going to get worse, but it's also an opportunity for trouble, for resistance, for metabolic imbalance in a good way. I'm really into destabilizing the metabolism of systems that we want to either go away or to become weaker. And that's sort of what the spirit of the talk is, to sort of think about different ways that we can weaken the petrostate. And a big part of the petrostate is its plastics, petroplastics.
This session has been very thought-provoking. There's so many ways in which the petrostate shapes every aspect of our lives, from the room we are in, all the different aspects, our mobility, the way we use our energy in daily life, how it affects our behavior, our attitudes, our way of thinking. So I'm very pleased with this keynote that we listened to today, and also with the discussion that we had. And I think we will have 2 very productive days, because these issues are not easily solved. And on the one hand, it may make us feel very depressed and hopeless. But on the other hand, we have a room full with people who come from different disciplines and from different universities around the world. And so I hope that in the next 2 days, we are able to dive a little bit deeper into the petrostate. What does it mean for us? What does it mean for our own research? What should we be researching? And what does our research mean for understanding the petrostate and related issues? I want to thank Professor Boyer for this wonderful keynote, and also thanks to all of you for being so engaged in the Q&A. And I hope that during coffee breaks, meals, the free time that we have in this afternoon, that we can continue these discussions and to learn from each of you what perspective do you bring into this broader debate, whether it's the individual behavior or the state or our philosophies behind all of this. And then hopefully by the end of the workshop, we not only feel that, oh, it's so depressing, but we also have ways to move our research forward and to be connected with other people in other countries, in other disciplines, to try together think through this huge transition that Professor Boyer has outlined so well for us today. Let's give Professor Boyer an applause.
Thank you so much.